Disclaimer: J.K. Rowling is our queen.
I'm sorry, Miss Granger,
Madame Pomfrey told her.
Professor Umbridge has ordered that Pepper-Up potion may not be given out for frivolous reasons. It's available only for students showing cold symptoms.
Hermione didn't bother protesting. She just sent Dobby to the Hogsmeade apothecary to buy one. Unfortunately, it would be suspicious to buy more than one at a time, but it would get her through the day, and the pain would surely get her through the evening. She didn't know what she'd do if Umbridge decided to stick it to her for an extra night, though. She could probably brew a Pepper-Up potion herself if she wanted, and she felt like she could use a calming draught too, but she didn't have enough time as it was. The second night of detention was just as bad as the first, with the added bonus of being dead tired and her hand hurting worse than before. It took 10 seconds to heal each line by the end of the night, and it left a faint, red, irritated mark behind. Umbridge just tut-tutted at this after another 8 grueling hours, and told her to come back the next night. 2,859. She'd carved those libelous words into her hand 2,859 times. She was pretty sure that was banned by the Geneva Conventions, let alone civil law, but Dolores Jane Umbridge was untouchable. Hermione blew off her friends more harshly than she did the previous night. She was too tired to think of anything but her homework. She slumped into her chair by her desk in the dorm. No matter how much she wanted to sleep, she had to press on and get her work done for the next day so as to not risk further punishment. She sent Dobby to the Three Broomsticks for more coffee, but this time, remembering her mistake last night, she was more careful. She took a couple of sips every half hour, applying a warming charm to the cup each time. It worked. She stayed awake through most of the night with no jitters. Granted, she was so tired she couldn't work as fast as she usually did, but she still got the job done. Hermione felt like a zombie on Wednesday, even with another Pepper-Up potion smuggled in from the apothecary. She walked through the halls in a daze, not noticing when danger was approaching.
You bitch! I can't believe you!
She wasn't surprised she ran into somebody on her way to lunch. It was only a matter of time. But she was surprised when she realized that the shove was deliberate. She staggered as she was knocked hard against a wall and looked up in surprise to see an irate Rebecca Gamp standing over her. She glanced around for Harry and Ron, but they must have got separated.
Rebecca,
she said.
The greatest discovery and transfiguration of the past half-century, and you had to go and ruin it for me,
she yelled, pushing her back against the wall when she tried to steady herself.
Rebecca, what are you talking about?
Hermione said nervously.
You know what I'm talking about. This!
She shoved the newspaper in Hermione's face. Gamp's Law Breakthrough. Prizeworthy or ethical failure?
What on earth? They say you stole my research to make yourself look better. Rebecca, I swear I didn't. And they say the discovery wasn't that big a deal anyway. They what? They're pushing to have the Gamp and Wenlock prizes withheld from us. All 3 of us. What? They are?
Hermione said in confusion.
I had no idea. Umbridge said she wrote a letter denouncing me. She never said anything about you or Septima. So you admit it was you?
Rebecca's wand appeared in her hand. Rebecca wasn't sure when that had happened. The girl's eyes flashed with fire. She instinctively reached for her own wand, but hesitated. She couldn't risk being caught fighting. It would be dangerous enough if she was caught with somebody shooting hexes at her. Umbridge would certainly try to twist it. Unfortunately, the decision might be out of her hands. At that moment she heard a cry of, "Oi, what are you doing?" and saw that Ron and Harry had rounded the corner. She knew how this must look, herself cowering in uncharacteristic fear from an older and more experienced girl with her wand drawn at her.
"No, Ron, don't!"
She tried to stop him, but she wasn't fast enough. Ron drew his wand without thinking and fired off a hex at Rebecca, but it splashed harmlessly against a shield charm.
"Back off, Weasley," Rebecca said. "Your little friend here is trying to ruin my career." "I'm not."
"Put your wand down."
"Ron, please stop." "You put yours down. This doesn't concern you."
"Not if you're going to hurt Hermione."
"Please, I don't want anyone to fight."
"Hermione, why aren't you doing something?" Ron said.
"I'm trying to discuss it calmly," Hermione said.
"She was about to hex you."
"I'll hex you too if you don't shut up,"
Rebecca spat. Harry seemed to have disappeared. He'd had his wand out too at first, but he'd held back. Perhaps he'd noticed that Hermione didn't have hers out, but she didn't know where he'd gone.
"Leave Hermione alone!"
Ron yelled.
"Ron, I mean it! Stop! Rebecca, I'm not trying to ruin anyone's career. Umbridge has it in for me, and she'll use any way she can to hurt me." "Well, you better do whatever you have to get right in Umbridge's book." "Like hell she will."
"Silencio!" Rebecca cast at Ron. And that was too much for Ron. Before Hermione could speak again, he started firing off hexes. He looked like he was shouting, but the spells were weakened by him being unable to make a sound, and Rebecca defended herself easily. Hermione just tried to back away from the fight, but a stray boil hex struck her in the face, and she cried out in pain and sank to the floor.
"Miss Gamp! Mr. Weasley!"
Everyone stopped and looked to the source of the sound. There, standing at the entrance to the corridor, was Septima, and beside her, panting, was Harry. Hermione sighed with relief and mouthed, "Thank you," at him. "Any time," he mouthed back. She doubted he had a clue what was going on, but he could still do something sensible.
"What is the meaning of this?"
Septima demanded of Rebecca. Rebecca looked down at her feet like a child with her hand caught in the biscuit tin.
"Hermione and I were discussing the article about our research in the Daily Prophet today." Must have been some discussion, then, Mr. Weasley?" she asked.
"She attacked Hermione and I," said an unsilenced Ron.
"I did not. You attacked me."
"You were threatening her." Septima cleared her throat properly. Nothing like Umbridge's false titters.
"I see. Hermione, what happened?"
Hermione staggered to her feet again.
"Rebecca was angry because of the article," she said. "I was trying to discuss it calmly with her, but then Ron came and started a big argument that—"
she looked between them,
"led to hexes being exchanged."
Septima gave a hard look to the three of them and judged that Hermione was probably telling the truth.
"I'm very disappointed in you two," she said. "Especially you, Miss Gamp. I saw enough of what you are casting. I expect better from my mastery students. Your independent study is suspended for 2 weeks."
Rebecca gasped indignantly, but didn't say anything.
"Both you and Mr. Weasley will serve detention with me this evening, and 50 points apiece will be taken."
This time Ron gasped indignantly, but before he could say anything, Septima turned to Harry.
"Mr. Potter, 20 points to Gryffindor for an appropriate response to the situation."
By which they all knew she meant making sure Umbridge didn't get involved, as well as going for help.
"Hermione, 5 points to Gryffindor for trying to resolve the situation in a non-violent way. Now, I think I should take you to the hospital wing."
"Why didn't you fight back?" Ron muttered as they walked.
"You never take that from Malfoy." "I can't talk about it,"
she muttered back. She could tell both Ron and Harry looked afraid for her. She knew it was out of character for her, but what else could she do? She'd been walking on eggshells all the time, and she hated it.
"Please trust me,"
she added hopefully. They seemed to accept it, but she knew it would only buy her time. She would need to tell them sooner or later. Madame Pomfrey reversed the curse soon enough, put a salve on her face to ease the pain, and called for a meal so she wouldn't miss lunch. But she was unhappy with Hermione's overall state at the moment. She was clearly sleep-deprived, and her stress levels were high, even for a 5th year. The Meta-Witch recommended some rest and a good night's sleep, which she politely acknowledged without committing to anything. Thankfully, she didn't try to keep her there longer. Septima skipped her lunch hour to sit with Hermione and told the boys to go on to lunch so they could speak alone.
"I don't condone violence, Hermione, but I must say I was surprised at you too," her favorite teacher said. "Why didn't you defend yourself? You wouldn't have got in trouble if Rebecca was the clear aggressor." "I wouldn't have if you'd found me," Hermione said softly. "If it had been Umbridge it would have been different, and I can't take any chances."
Septima frowned at her.
Hermione, I know something's wrong with you. Even the boys could tell. I know you might not be comfortable telling them, but I hope you can at least tell me, or Madame Pomfrey or Professor McGonagall."
It was true, she thought. She was more comfortable with Septima about some things.
It's Umbridge,"
she muttered, and then, after a moment's thought, she added,
"Detentions." "Detentions?"
she gasped. Her eyes flicked to Hermione's hand.
"You? How? What happened?" "That wasn't the worst, though." "What?" "Umbridge, she—" "Hermione, please, what is it?" "She threatened my parents."
"What?" And then it all came pouring out. Her futile attempts at outmaneuvering Umbridge, her small victory for Harry, the persistent goading and needling about her research, seemingly for revenge, the letters denouncing her, the detentions, and the legal threats against her family. Septima looked on in horror at the sight of her favorite student shaking with fear and constantly looking over her shoulder. She never thought she'd see the day when even Dolores Umbridge would break Hermione Granger's spirit.
"Expel you and then arrest your parents for your truancy?" she said. "I'm so sorry, Hermione. I had no idea they would. Well, of course they would, but I had no idea they could. I know. I nearly panicked when she told me, but she was right. It's called contributing to the delinquency of a minor in the Muggle world, and a corrupt system like Fudge's regime could easily pull it off. There's nothing I can do, and I have to go back all this week."
Septima shook her head.
"I can't imagine what you're going through right now. I wish I could help more, but Umbridge doesn't like you much either, I know. Hermione, you can't let her beat you like this. There must be something you can do to get out from under that woman's thumb without endangering yourself or your parents."
Damn it, she was a Slytherin, Septima thought, and smarter than Dolores. Plots were supposed to be her thing.
"There is," Hermione said. "Remember? My whole family's planning to move to France over Christmas holidays. I'll be overseas for the duration. I just have to hope she doesn't find an excuse to get rid of me before then. She hasn't got rid of Harry yet, so I'm probably safe for now, but I know it's not a certainty."
Suddenly she got an idea.
"But I think there might be something you could do sooner than that." "Like what?" "You need to be enrolled with an accredited educational program, right? I know they refused Count Beauxbatons, but you could at least still look for a private tutor starting now."
Hermione gave her a confused look.
"But everyone says getting a private tutor is almost impossible for a Muggle-born." "Key word. Almost impossible. And that's for an average Muggle-born, not for Hermione Granger. Despite what Umbridge says, everyone in the field knows how brilliant you are, and even if that's not enough on its own, you'll have an even better chance if I write a letter of recommendation for you. My name may not carry far here, but it does out there."
Her eyes widened.
"You'd do that? Thank you. How would I do it?" "I'll put together a list of accredited tutors who I think would be interested in you. You'll need to write to them and request enrollment with them effective immediately. Your parents will probably need to sign something at some point."
But Hermione shook her head.
"That's no good. Umbridge is reading my post."
"What?" Septim was shocked, but then again,
"I know what that rumor says," she ventured. "I started that rumor, Septima. I know it's true." "What? How?" "I have a way of getting messages through to my parents without fear of interception. When I compared them with the letters sent by Owl, the Owl post had been tampered with."
So the rumor was true. Well, that was questionably legal at best, but like everything else Dolores did, they were powerless to stop it.
"These secret messages you're sending," she asked, "is there any chance you could use them to write to the tutors?" "No, just my family." And headquarters, Hermione thought. "It's no good for anything else unless—"
Suddenly she got that glint in her eyes that heralded a brilliant idea.
"Septima, how do people normally send letters if they don't have an owl?" "There's an owl post office in Hogsmeade and another one in Diagon Alley." Do they rent out post office boxes? Of course.
Hermione's tear-stricken face brightened into a knowing grin.
Septima, get me that list.
The rest of the day passed in a blur for Hermione. Though she was in better spirits, they quickly vanished when her detention began. Even with the pain of constant cutting into her hand, it was hard not to fall asleep across the blood-stained parchment. She wasn't crying or making much of any noise anymore, which seemed to frustrate Umbridge a little, but it just went on and on. She remembered Harry's third detention ending quickly, but this one kept going on hour after hour, and her hand kept stubbornly healing, if barely. She realized only too late that applying the Murtlap essence early had soothed it and improved the healing of the cuts. All she'd done was stretch her torture out further. It wasn't until midway through the 5th hour, 3507, that her hand finally stopped healing and left thin red lines oozing blood in her skin. She wondered what to do. Should she speak up or not? She resisted the urge to just wipe the blood all over the lacy tablecloth. Umbridge soon noticed she'd stopped scribbling and inspected her hand.
Yes, it looks like you're starting to get the message, she said. That's enough for tonight. I'll want to see you tomorrow evening again, of course. You may go.
Thank you, Professor, Hermione ground out. The common room was quiet, but not deserted when she got back this time, and a few other people looked her way when she climbed into the portrait hole. Naturally, her friends jumped up to greet her with concerned faces.
Hermione, you're back!
George rushed to her.
Harry was saying it shouldn't take so long by the third night. Are you okay? Did she...
She held up a hand to stop him.
George, whatever you have to say, it can wait till morning. I'm about to fall asleep on my feet.
Well, then, good night. Sleep well, Hermione. He looked crestfallen, but he kissed her on the cheek and let her go. She wrapped her hand in the Murtlap-soaked handkerchief again when she got to her room. It wasn't likely to prolong her detention much at this point, and she needed the pain relief now. After asking Parvati to wake her at 8 o'clock and thanking God that she'd managed to push a day ahead on her homework, she passed out fully clothed on her bed. Parvati woke her up not at 8 o'clock, but just 2 hours later, to remind her that they had to go to astronomy class. Hermione swore so loudly that her roommates backed away in fear, but she still went because she wasn't about to get cited for missing class. She trudged up to the astronomy tower, where Professor Sinestra took one look at her and asked her if she was all right. Harry and Ron immediately jumped in to explain about the detentions before she could protest, but that turned out to be a good thing because Professor Sinestra wrote her a note to go back to bed at once. Hermione honestly could have kissed her. She didn't have the luxury of sleeping for 16 hours like the last time she'd pulled back-to-back all-nighters, but after an uninterrupted 10 hours, she felt reasonably rested, albeit not back at 100%. George, however, was most chipper. He gave her a searing kiss that she really wasn't awake enough for, the first chance he got, and once again asked her about her detentions. She answered vaguely and said that she had flipped out before because she was tired and in pain and dismayed that Umbridge had outmaneuvered her so thoroughly, not wanting to be too specific about her plan just yet.
"Did you want us to—" he started to say.
"No!" "Come on, Hermione, you have to let us do something," he protested. "It's my duty as a boyfriend and our duty as the school pranksters."
"Please, not this time, George. Umbridge is too good. You can't defy her to her face. It'll only cause trouble for you."
But what if we stole her quill?" "And burned it," Fred added. "That would stop her, wouldn't it?" Hermione shook her head.
"No good. She invented it. She could always make another one, and it'll just make her angrier."
George frowned heavily. He knew she was right, no matter how much he disliked it.
"Then what can we do?" he asked. "I can't stand seeing you like this."
"Me neither," said Fred.
"The D.A. That's how we fight her. What we do in the shadows. Anything we can do to foil her agenda here is a victory."
She smiled then.
"And besides, you don't want to risk getting in trouble 2 days before the first Quidditch game, do you?"
That made George smile back. "True that," he said. "Oh, I almost forgot. Here." He handed her a bracelet. "Updated daydream charm. You look like you could use it. Just tell us how it goes, okay?" Hermione was grateful, but she stowed it for that evening after her detention. In the meantime, Septima apparently worked fast, as she passed Hermione a list of names over lunch hour. Thank God she had someone on her side with actual power. Hermione didn't have time to do much with it, but she did have a little bit of time after herbology to start putting her plan into action.
"Dobby?"
"Pop." She was a little surprised when the first words out of Dobby's mouth were,
"Miss Hermione, I thinks you should not drink so much coffee. You will be sick if you is not sleeping more." That's fine, Dobby," she said. "I think I'm done with that for now. I called you for something else."
"Oh!" Dobby looked uncomfortable at his own impertinence.
"How can Dobby be helping, then?"
She handed him a couple of gallons and a few sickles.
"I want you to go to the Owl Post Office in Hogsmeade and rent out a post office box for me in the name of—"
She stopped and considered the possibilities, then smiled.
"In the name of Archimedes. If there are any forms I need to fill out, bring them to me, unless I'm in detention by then. In that case, wait till I get back to my dorm."
"Is you needing another way to send a post, miss?"
"Yes, I'm going to need to send secure messages to people other than my parents in the order. I need to write them first, so I'll just rent out the box for now."
"Yes, Miss Hermione." The post office box did require some forms, and 3 gallons per year, but they were short and simple, and, best of all, they weren't picky about the pseudonym as long as she paid up. Soon she was the proud owner of the address, P.O. Box 314, Hogsmeade, Scotland. And she still had to go to detention. The cuts on her hand opened up and started bleeding again without healing within half an hour, but Umbridge told her to keep going. There was no way to stop the blood from dripping down on the tablecloth, even if there wasn't much of it, but the woman didn't seem to care. Still, she let Hermione go after 2 hours, leaving her the evening to do as she pleased. She started by snogging George as hard as she could in front of the entire common room as soon as she got back, because he informed her that he and Fred had saved her food from dinner. She told her and Septima's plan to her friends that night in strict confidence, without going into too much detail why she was doing it. Their reactions ranged from dismay that she might be leaving them even sooner — they hadn't really thought much about the fact that she was planning to spend a spring term in France — to interest in what private tutoring would be like compared with Hogwarts. Harry said he'd put in a good word for her, except it would probably be counterproductive at the moment.
"It could be good doing that," Ron said. "I mean, I don't think I'd want to do school on my own, but you could go to Hogsmeade whenever you wanted."
"No Quidditch, though," Fred pointed out. "Who'd want to live like that?"
"Well, it'll only be a few weeks at most," she replied with a roll of her eyes. "And if all goes well, not at all."
"Say, couldn't you do it for the whole spring term?" George said. Hermione turned and stared at him.
I mean, then you'd still be in the country, and you could visit on Hogsmeade days."
She jumped to her feet. She nearly bolted to her room, but she stopped long enough to kiss him on the cheek and say,
"That's why you're the smart twin."
"Oi!" she heard Fred yell behind her as she dashed up the stairs. She soon reached the dorm and scribbled a note.
"Dear Mom and Dad, about selling the practice and moving to France. Hold off on making anything final unless absolutely necessary. We may need to change our plans quickly. Long story. I'll tell you when I know more. Love from Hermione."
That was a good start, so she had Dobby deliver it right away while she got started on the letters to the list of tutors Septima had given her. If she wrote a form letter and copied it down for each one, she could probably finish it tonight. It was a short list. Her hand ached from the cuts and cramped from all the writing she'd been doing, but at least she wasn't writing down those same 5 words over and over again for once. She took her time to craft a letter that sounded respectful, knowledgeable, and very interested without sounding desperate. Septima had been helpful enough to jot down a few notes to help her out, which was good because there were certain small etiquettes to be observed that were probably a mix of pure-blood traditions and a legacy of the old-time apprenticeship system. She did have one extra bit she added, though, a polite inquiry into how the accreditation had changed under Educational Decree 21, and whether there were any new steps in the process that would involve her. It was a question that might have seemed a bit uninformed, but not one that a complete novice would ask. Hopefully she would glean from the replies how easy or difficult it would be for the ministry to revoke her tutor's accreditation just to spite her. Although she wondered, if it got her out of the Hogwarts where she couldn't corrupt any students, would Umbridge even care? In any case, once she had a letter that she thought looked good, she started writing out the copies she needed. It was then that Dobby delivered her parents' reply to her note. She frowned as she read it. She should have realized that it might distress them.
Dear Hermione, we will hold off on the sales if you want. There is still time in the process, but you need to tell us if something is wrong. Are you in danger at school? Is something happening here at home? We don't understand why our plans to move out of the country would suddenly become a problem, and we do hope you're still all right at Hogwarts. Love, Mum and Dad.
They'd be wanting a reply tonight. She knew that even before Dobby said as much. She grabbed another piece of parchment and started to write.
Dear Mum and Dad.
Part of her wanted to write a long letter detailing, well, not everything that had gone on, but quite a bit of it. But somehow she couldn't bring herself to do it. The detentions had been pressing down on her so heavily all week that she didn't even want to think about them. And what would her parents say when she told them? She'd glossed over Harry's detentions earlier as much as she thought she could get away with. No, she'd hold off and explain things in detail later.
Problems with Umbridge. No actual danger, but I may need to reevaluate my plans for the spring term. I'd write more, but I've been insanely busy this week. I'll get back to you when I have answers. Love from Hermione.
Hopefully that would tide them over. Her final detention went about as smoothly as was possible, and when it was over she felt much lighter. She was finally free. She decided to celebrate by trying out the twins' new daydream charm. It was very pleasant, but she was uncomfortable with how risque her subconscious made it. That seemed like something they ought to adjust, but George and Fred would probably say it wasn't a bug, but a feature. On Saturday, Hermione was finally able to pay attention to the rest of the castle again. She had barely remembered the Quidditch match, the always eventful Gryffindor-Slytherin match that usually kicked off the season. But apparently it was a big deal. Slytherin had made numerous attempts to hex Gryffindor's players in the corridors, to which Snape had turned a blind eye. They'd been particularly taunting to Ron because he was the newest player and wasn't used to it. Harry, in contrast, barely seemed to notice the trash talk anymore, and when he did, he gave as good as he got. This morning, half the school was decked out in red and green, and Luna was wearing a hat that looked like a life-sized lion's head, which roared on command. Luna was the artistic type, she recalled. Hermione, however, elected to have a short visit with Septima before the match. They'd skipped their independent study lesson today, but she needed to thank her for helping her through the week and see what was going on with the other matters at hand.
Rebecca's still furious, Septima said. I've warned her to stay away from you, and I think I've got her to accept that it's not your fault. But she's still angry, and she's not dealing with it very well, though I admit I can't blame her that much. This ought to be the crowning achievement of a researcher's career, but, well, you see what ministry pressure can do. I'm not happy with it myself, but I'm sure this is directed at me almost as much as it is you, so I know where to place the blame. I still don't understand why Umbridge went after Rebecca after all, unless it was to get to me, Hermione said. What do you think will happen? If the ministry keeps putting the pressure on the journals, I'm afraid they'll fold. Not that they believe the lies, at least I hope they don't, but because Fudge could make their positions in Magical Britain untenable if he really set his mind to it. It might be hard for you to appreciate, living in the Muggle world, but the ministry controls everything in this country. Not directly, but they're friends with the people who do. Like how all of the corrupt politicians and businessmen are golfing buddies with one another, she suggested. Golfing? Is that a Muggle game? Yes. Anyway, I get the picture. What do you think we should do? I don't know. If we're lucky, this will just blow over. Umbridge has already got you for showing her up with the Quidditch thing. If she doesn't let up, there's not much we can do, though. It's not fair to Rebecca, as cross as I am with her, but politics stomps on everything sooner or later.
Hermione said nothing and let the thought stew for a while.
"Does your hand hurt?"
Septima asked gently, noticing the red marks.
"A little. I've been treating it with myrtle essence all week, so the pain's not too bad, but I don't think it'll fully heal."
She shook her head.
"I never thought she would be capable of that when we were in school, though perhaps I should have seen it. And how many times writing it that must have taken?" 4,193,
Hermione said, and Septima blanched.
"Sorry,"
she added. The grand total had been 4,193 lines when she finished on Friday night. She was sure she would have a scar that read, "I must not tell lies," on her hand for the rest of her life, just like Harry. Who would have thought she'd get a war scar without ever fighting in the war? If she did stay in Britain, the ministry would be making some changes, sooner or later. She would see to that. But at least if she played her cards right, no one would ever be able to force that torture on her again. Harry was still at risk.
"Anyway, how's Georgina doing?"
she asked, hoping for a lighter topic.
"She's doing fine in her classes," Septima said. "She's brilliant at arithmancy. I worry about her, of course." "Of course," she agreed. "About Umbridge or—" "About everything. I'm not that worried about Umbridge, really. Georgina's only in second year, and she's a Slytherin. I've told her to keep her head down, and Umbridge will probably go easier on her even though she's my grandniece. But the other things—well, we both know that you know who is out there. It's going to become very dangerous for everybody very soon, whether they're involved or not. And also, well, she's a Slytherin. I remember what it was like in the last war. You know who did an awful lot of his recruiting in Slytherin House right under our noses. We tried to quash it, of course, but there was only so much we could do. Anyone who spoke against him in Slytherin learned pretty quickly not to do it again. Those who tried to stay out of it were usually okay, unless they were especially talented, which, frankly, Georgina is."
Hermione nodded.
"I could tell. It'll start with small things. Weak brainwashing now by the older students, building up to a lot of pressure to join up if the war goes on into her 5th year, Merlin forbid."
3 years from now. Hermione shuddered. She didn't want to think about it going that long.
"So, basically, I'm worried about her getting in over her head with no one to protect her, or needing to defend herself in general, and look who she's getting defense instruction from,"
Hermione finished. Septima nodded. They sat in silence and sipped their tea while a wild idea entered Hermione's mind. It sounded crazy at first. For one, Georgina was only a second year. But she was a bright second year, and Dennis Creevey was only a second year too. For another, would a Slytherin ever be accepted? But if she was trying to push for inter-house unity, who better than a Slytherin Hermione could vouch for personally, who also happened to be the grandniece of a professor who was known for being much fairer than Snape? Most importantly, though, would a Georgina, or Septima for that matter, be willing to go along with it? Well, it couldn't hurt to try, could it? She trusted Septima well enough.
"Septima," she said, "if there was, hypothetically, a way for Georgina to get proper defense instruction, what would you think about that?"
Septima's eyes narrowed at her suspiciously.
"I would think that, hypothetically, that would probably be an expellable offense under the current school rules. I'm pretty sure our esteemed High Inquisitor would not approve a study group of that nature." "I'm sure she wouldn't, but I was thinking, hypothetically, of something slightly more expellable, but also protected with a magical contract of secrecy and other reliable protections against being found out by the teachers, Filch and Umbridge in particular."
Septima's eyebrows shot up, and Hermione smiled.
"In that situation," Septima said cautiously, "I would definitely want to know exactly what the consequence of breaking the contract was."
Hermione made a quick decision. She'd been vague to everyone else, but a Slytherin, and a responsible grand-aunt, would want to know the exact consequence.
"Nothing too harmful, I'm sure," she said. "Just a bad case of acne that writes sneak across one's face."
That seemed to surprise Septima again.
"Maybe you should have taken the sorting hat's offer of Slytherin," she said, to which Hermione rolled her eyes. "In that case, if Georgina was willing to go along with it, which I suspect she might be, and if I trusted the person who wrote the contract and laid down the protections, I think I would be okay with her taking such a risk. Although I would be interested what protections you believe a bright fifth-year student could lay down that would foil a determined ministry official."
Hermione just smiled and said,
"You haven't taught me everything I know, Septima."
She smiled back.
"I see. Good answer. For a Slytherin. If you think I'd spend one night in the same dungeon as Draco Malfoy, you've got another think coming. But thank you. To be honest, I thought you'd turn me down flat." "Don't think it's an easy decision, Hermione, but it's one that every parent, or in my case grand aunt, has to make in times like this. I care more about Georgina learning to defend herself properly than the risk of an expulsion that, if there's any justice in the world, will be reversed before her owl year. That said, if her parents ever get wind of this, I'll deny everything and tell them I argued strenuously against it."
Hermione giggled uncomfortably, but she had her answer. She'd probably approach Harry later and run it by him before going through with it, but she had a good feeling about it.
"Honestly, I should be thanking you, Hermione," Septima continued. "Someone has to stand up against the hypothetical evil and corruption in this world, especially in dark times like this."
She sighed heavily.
"I feel like I'm getting too old for this." "You're not that old, Septima." "Maybe not, but after seeing one war through and signs of another starting, it feels like it. And my 50th birthday is coming up in the spring term." "When is your birthday? I don't think I ever asked." "The 8th of February." "So, exactly 9 months after VE Day?" Septima chuckled. "Nothing gets by you, does it?" "Not really, though I would have guessed 10 years younger if you hadn't told me Umbridge was your roommate in school."
They both laughed at that.
"So, any other family?"
Hermione asked. She honestly didn't know much about Septima's family besides Georgina.
No, just Georgina and her parents and my brother. I never married or anything. When I was young, when I first started teaching here, I thought about marrying and starting a family. Then the war came, and I sort of lost track of that dream. By the time it ended, I was happy here, and I just wasn't interested anymore. And in '83, Georgina was born, and I thought that was enough for me. For a while," she added, seemingly to herself. "For a while? What changed?" Hermione asked, hoping she wasn't overstepping. "I met you," she said.
Silence fell for a moment, and she added,
"I remember seeing you, 11 years old, filled with boundless enthusiasm, and the brightest child I'd ever met. You were almost like the daughter I'd always hoped I could have. Sorry, I shouldn't be dumping my personal baggage on you." "I don't mind, really. We're friends, aren't we?" "Yes, I suppose we are, strange as it is. Even now I wonder if I could. 50 isn't too late to start for Witch, but it's getting close. But now another war's coming, and, well, I just don't know."
Hermione wasn't sure how to respond to that. She rarely thought about the fact that so few of the teachers at Hogwarts were married, much less why. How many of them were committed bachelors or bachelorettes like Dumbledore seemed to be? And how many were products of interrupted lives and dreams, like Septima? She felt like she ought to say something, despite being so much younger.
"I really don't know what's right for you, Septima," she tried. But I do know one thing, and that's that I was only able to get together with George by getting over my uncertainty about the future and not allowing it to control my life."
Septima showed a wan little smile.
"I think that's a little easier for Gryffindor." "Ugh, do we really have to keep divining people by their houses?" she snapped. Okay, but you're still a braver person than I am." "I don't feel very brave right now." "You certainly sounded like it a few minutes ago. Don't let one defeat, even a deep one like this," she motioned to her hand, "get to you. If you can face that and still face up to Umbridge in some other way, even if it's behind her back, that's very brave of you. Hypothetically, of course."
Hermione got up and hugged her.
Thank you so much, Septima.
Then she checked the clock.
Oh no, we're going to be late for the match. Oops, better hurry. I don't want to have to answer to Snape for missing Slytherin's win.
Oh, ha ha! They both rushed down to the Quidditch pitch and made it just as the match was starting. It seemed like bog-standard Quidditch at first, until the Slytherins started singing. That was strange. Hermione couldn't make out the words at first while she hurried to her seat, but she soon caught the chorus. Weasley is our king, Weasley is our king, he always lets the quaffle in, Weasley is our king.
Oh no,
Hermione groaned. It was bad enough that the Slytherins were taunting Ron all week, but now they were preying on his self-confidence during the match. Was that kind of catcalling even allowed? They hardly let up the whole game, singing about how he was born in a bin and was a terrible flyer. It threw him off his game, which Harry and Ginny insisted was pretty good when he was on it, and he really did let the quaffle in every time. The game was only saved when Harry caught the snitch before they got too far behind, but the moment he did, Crabbe hit a bludger at him that slammed square into his lower back and knocked him off his broom.
Harry!
She yelled. She rushed down to the Quidditch pitch to see if he was okay. To her relief, he got up before she got to him. But then Malfoy started taunting the Gryffindors, and before she knew it, Fred and George tried to attack him. Angelina and Harry held them back, but then Malfoy said something else that made both Harry and George attack him.
George, no!
She cried out, but she was too late. Harry and George were both being hauled off to Professor McGonagall's office before she reached them, and she got a sick feeling in her stomach when she saw Umbridge following after them a few minutes later. Fred filled her in on all of Malfoy's insults in graphic detail, such a stream of invective that Hermione had to wonder if it had been pre-planned with Umbridge, as even Malfoy wasn't normally that bad and was more careful about not getting punched in the face. It had started with fat and ugly for Mrs. Weasley and useless loser for Mr. Weasley, then graduated to the Weasleys' house smelling like a pigsty, and finally insinuating that Harry's mother, being a Muggle-born, stank just as badly, which was what set Harry off. She wanted to punch out Malfoy too after that, but she despaired to think what horrid punishments Umbridge had dreamt up for them. She was about to find out. Harry and George entered the common room, looking as pale as ghosts.
Harry, George, what is it? What did she do to you? More detentions?
Worse, Harry said in a hollow voice. Yeah, way worse, George echoed. Freddie, get over here. I don't know how to say this, but that toad gave you the same punishment. Said you would have hit Malfoy if Angie hadn't stopped you. Well, she's right there. What did she do to us? She... George was choking on the words. He looked like he was about to cry. She banned us from Quidditch, Harry spat out. What? Half the common room gasped. Banned us for life, he added, and confiscated our brooms.
What? No! She can't do that! She can't! Hermione protested. Please tell us she can't do that, George.
She did it, he mumbled, and McGonagall didn't stop her. Hermione collapsed into a seat, as did the boys.
Confiscating your brooms, though?
She did it.
That can't be. There must be something wrong with that,
she fumed. There had to be something she could do. This was her best friend, her boyfriend, and her boyfriend's twin. There had to be something she could do to help them. Umbridge kept hurting the people she cared about, and she felt powerless. That woman had pretty much sucked all the fun out of Harry's life now. There had to be some small way she could fight back, but she couldn't approach Umbridge herself, not after the week she'd had. But maybe someone else could. Seized with sudden purpose, she jumped up, walked out of the common room, and went straight to Professor McGonagall's office.
"Excuse me, Professor,"
she called. McGonagall looked up. She looked like she might have been crying herself, but she hid it quickly.
"Oh, Miss Granger, good afternoon. I'm afraid if you're here about Mr. Potter's and Mrs. Weasley's punishments, there's nothing I can do. Professor Umbridge has final authority over all discipline." "I know, ma'am. I just wanted some clarification about it. Does Professor Umbridge actually have the authority to give Harry, George, and Fred a lifetime Quidditch ban? I didn't even think punishments could carry over to next year, and then there's after school." "I'm afraid, Miss Granger," McGonagall cut her off, "that as long as Professor Umbridge remains High Inquisitor, and as long after that as that educational decree stays in force, she can stop those boys from playing Quidditch at school. You are right that she doesn't have direct authority over the National Quidditch League, but with her connections to the Ministry, I'm sure she can convince them to issue a ban as well." "Ah, I was afraid it would be something like that, ma'am. But does she really have the authority to confiscate their brooms too? Those are personal property, and they're not contraband or anything. It's not like she even banned them from recreational flying, so they could still use them legally."
McGonagall perked up at the thought, and she started thinking.
You may be right about that, Miss Granger. I'm afraid I was so stunned earlier that I didn't think of it. I'll speak to Professor Umbridge about it. She might be able to invoke some regulation to keep them locked in her office for now, but I'm certain I can force her to give them back when their boys leave for the Christmas holidays." "Thank you, Professor. I'm glad I could do something for them. Oh, but do me a favor and don't mention my name to Professor Umbridge, please." "Of course not, Miss Granger, and thank you for bringing this to my attention. 10 points to Gryffindor."
Her conversation with Professor McGonagall took the edge off, but Hermione was still furious with Professor Umbridge for everything she'd done all week. And it didn't really solve Harry's problem at all. He was still completely under her heel, and so was Hermione herself for now. So she did what she hadn't had the time or energy to do that week. She stormed off to the room of requirement and cursed a pink-clad dummy into tiny pieces.